Today we're learning Maseches Gittin Daf Samach Gimel. As a preface for today's daf, I just want to say, as I've said a few times throughout these types of dafim, because we don't talk in these languages, the subtleties are hard to appreciate. Very soft differences between the languages of how to engage a shliach. Hiskabel, the first language we're going to see over here is Havei. These languages don't sound very different to us. But in Hebrew and in the parlance of the day, they were very, very, very big differences, as we'll soon see. So I recognize in advance that this Gemara is going to sound a little bit like overly technical and the languages are hard to appreciate. Just remember that we don't live in their times. In English, we would appreciate some of these differences, and I'll bring up some examples as we move along. So we're starting 4 lines from the bottom with the Amoraim. Itmar, it was stated by the Amoraim, the bottom of Samach Beis Mid Beis. If a woman says, Havei li giti, please bring me my get, that's what she says to the shliach. And then the shliach goes over to the man and he says to the husband, V'ishtecha amra, he misquotes, he misrepresents what the woman actually said, what the wife said. And he said, Hiskabel li giti. So there's a difference. One is Havei, bring me my get. The other is I want you to receive my get for me. Those are very big differences. And then the husband, in response to this disinformation, says, V'hu amar, Heilach kamasha amra. Whatever she said, whatever, I don't care. I just want to be divorced. Let's get this over with. But there's a big difference because if I hand it to him, if I'm the husband, and really it was just Havei, but it wasn't Hiskabel, then if it's Havei, they're not divorced yet. But if in fact he was commanded to receive on her behalf, then he's a shliach, then they're divorced. Then they're divorced. So Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Rabba bar Avua, Amar Rav, Afilu higia get liyada ein megureshes. No, they're absolutely not divorced. Even if it gets to her hand, they're not divorced. This is a zero. This is a zero because the shliach misrepresented himself. The Isha said to the shliach, Havei li giti, bring me my get. He lied and said hiskabel. So hiskabel means that when the shliach takes it in his hand, they should be divorced. He misrepresented. That's not what she said. She said, bring me my get. So therefore, they're not divorced. Maraf Sinigra, the whole thing is an error. And the Gemara tries to extrapolate from here, Shma Mina, Adibur Didei Kasamich, that the reason why this didn't work is because we relied on the wording of the shliach. The shliach said, hiskabel, he was wrong, and therefore they're not divorced. And therefore, says the Gemara, had it been that they relied on her words, then what did she say? Get it to my hand. She said, Havei li, get it into my hands. And if we relied on her, then michimati gita liada, miha tigarish. It would have been that she would have been divorced. So therefore, the Gemara is trying to solve a problem from another Masechta. The Gemara is trying to solve a problem, I believe it's from Bava Metzia, where there's a discussion where we have a misrepresentation. Whose language do we follow? The language of the shliach or the language of the Baal? So the Gemara tries to bring a rai from our Gemara that it must be adibur adidei, the language of the shliach, because otherwise, in this case, why would Rav, really Rav Nachman in the name of Rav, why would Rav Nachman say that they're not divorced even when it gets to her hand? Ella, it must be that we don't listen to her voice. We rely on his misrepresented voice, and then the whole thing's a zero, and they're not divorced. Again, all the nafkaminas, mamzerus, whatever the case may be. So Amar Rav Ashi, no, you can't compare the case that we just presented 4 lines from the bottom to the case in Bava Metzia. Why not? Because Amar Rav Ashi, hachi hashta, how can you compare them? Bishlama, I could understand in regards to the case that we started with, and we're on the top of Samach Gimel Amud Aleph, that itmar ibcha, had it been that the misrepresentation was the other way, where she said to the shliach, hiskabel li giti, I want you to be my shliach to receive the get. And then he misrepresents in a more lenient way and says, V'ishtecha amar, he says to the husband, what your wife said is Havei li giti. And then the husband says, okay, whatever, I don't know what actually happened, but he says, V'hu amar, heilach kamasha amra, do your thing. And then V'amar Rav Nachman amar Rabba bar Avua amar Rab, kevan shegia get liyada megureshes, al madi buradida. I could understand I could understand that if the case was reversed, in the initial case, she said Havei, and he misrepresented by saying hiskabel. In case number 2, we're saying over here that she really said hiskabel, and he misrepresented and said Havei. So in that case, had it been that that was the case, and we could have said that we followed her language, inami liada, or if he would have said to her hand, then you're right, then it would have been true. But in this case, adibur didei kasamich. Elahacha, but over here, in the case that we're dealing with in our case, that's totally the wrong scenario, because what did he do? Mishum da'akre shliach l'shlichusei legamre. This guy completely lied, and he did so in a way that wasn't good for the woman. And says the Gemara, Hu da amar shliach lekabala havena. He said, I'm a mekabel, I'm a shliach on behalf of the isha, and really leholacha lo havena, and that he wasn't supposed to be for holacha. So this, the Gemara says, is therefore not a raya. I could understand how the case has been reversed that we'd have a raya for Rav Nachman, but therefore we don't have a raya for Rav Nachman. And the Gemara then asks a question on Rav Nachman's shita, 8 lines down on Samach Gimel Amud Aleph. Amar Rav Huna bar Chia Tashma, we have a brisa. HaOmer his kabel get zeli ishti. If a person says, receive this for my wife, or holech get zeli ishti, or bring this get to my wife, that as long as she hasn't received it, he's allowed to be choser on the get. He can stop the get in its tracks. And the Gemara makes a diuk 4 lines before the wide lines. Taima deratza. The reason why he's able to do that is because he wanted to. Halo ratza, but if he didn't want to, have a get, then it would have been a get ve'amai. But why would you say that would have been a valid get? After all, habal lav bar shivu yeshliach lekabalahu. In the opening of this case, we use the line where it says, "His kabel get zela ishti." I, as a husband, cannot establish who the shliach will be for my wife. I can only take care of myself for shlichus. I could send you as my shliach. My wife can hire you as a shliach. I can't hire you as my wife's shliach. In Chavana Adam El Bafanav. It has to be on her terms. So the Gemara says that Ella, what must be the case? 2 lines before the wide lines. It must be that Amrinan, that Kevan Shenosan Ein of Lagarsha, once the husband felt and decided that he wanted to be divorced, Meimar Amar, we therefore say, Tigaresh kol hechi de migrusha. I don't really care how we get divorced. I just want to get divorced. And Hachanami, here too it must be the case that Kevan Shanasav Ein of Lagarsha, Meimar Amar Tigaresh kol hechi de migarsha. So the Gemara wants to say over here that perhaps this is going to be a kasha on Rav Nachman, because maybe we're dealing with a case where it is Kevan Shanasan Ein of Lagarsha, and over here we see that the divorcing actually works. And that's a kasha on Rav Nachman. So the Gemara says, no, these cases are as well not comparable. Hachi hashta, a third of the way down, second of the wide lines. Hasam Adam Yodeya She'ein Shlichus Lekabala V'Gomar V'Nasan L'Shem Holacha. There, the guy knew that he was not really a shliach to be makabel, and he lied, and he said that he was really for holacha. But hacha tai. But here, in the other case, there's just pashut and error. It's not right. He's actually not a shliach lekabbalah. He's not. So therefore, the cases are not comparable. So Amar Rava, let's try another question against Rav Nachman. Amar Rava Tashma. Ketana, a young girl who's married, she'amra, she says to a man, he's kabali giti. So this girl, let's call her 11 years old. She says to a man, please be makabel my get for my husband. Rocky road, even for the young couple. So says the Gemara, Eino get ad shiagia get liyada, that if she says to a person, I want you to be my shaliach, so that doesn't work at all. It's not a get until it gets to her hand. And kimati gita liyada miha magarsha. But once it gets into her hands, she's taka divorced. So the Gemara says, wait, ve'amai, ve'ha lav shliach leholacha shabya. Why would that be the case? This guy was only asked to be a shliach. He wasn't asked to do holacha. He was asked to be a mekabel, and that's not the same thing. Ella, says the Gemara, what must be the case? Amrinan, we must say that Kevan Shanas and Enev Lagarsha, just like we saw earlier, that once the husband wanted to divorce her, Meimar Amar, he says, Tigarish kol hechet migrasha, that perhaps he just wants to get divorced one way or the other. He doesn't care which way it is. And Hachanami, perhaps in our case where Rav Nachman says that they're not divorced, perhaps we should say that Kevan Shanas and Enev Lagarsha, Meimar Amar, Tigarish kol hechet migrasha. And again, Akasha and Rav Nachman, that this brisa seems to say that this husband might not care at all. He just wants to get divorced. He wants it over with. And therefore, who cares if it's laholach? Who cares if it's with lakabala? The husband's fine if it's lakabala or laholach. He just wants to get divorced. So that's a kasha again on Rav Nachman. So the Gemara says halfway down on Samech Gimel Amud Aleph, Hachi Hashta, these two cases are not comparable. Hasam, in the case of the katan, Adam Yodea She'ein Shlichus Lekatan. The reason why this did not work out for the katan is because katanim have no shlichus. A ketana who wants to get divorced cannot halachically, mechanically create a scenario of a shliach being makabel a get on her behalf. So that's why over there, that doesn't work. But, says the Gemara, where is it? But says the Gemara 6-7 lines down into the wide lines, and v'gamar v'nasan la l'shum holacha didei. And the way that it should have been done is that he just should have been for holacha, not for kabbalah. But hacha, in our case, tai. In the opening case that we started with today, again, he misrepresented what the wife had said. The wife had said, "I want you to be maybe the get, just to bring it to me," and he lied or made a misrepresentation and said that it was supposed to be mekabel. So hachatai. So therefore, there's no longer a question on Rav Nachman. None of the cases yet are similar to the cases of Rav Nachman. And halfway down, the Gemara continues in the middle of the line, Tashma. Haveli giti, if a woman says to someone, "I want you to please bring me my get," that's not the shlichus of Kabbalah, that's the shlichus of holacha. And then the shliach goes to the man and says, "Ve'ishtecha amra," your wife said, "He's kabeli giti." That's very similar to our Mishnah. Or if she said, "He's kabeli giti," this is the opposite. Or if she says, "I want you to be my shliach lekabbalah," ve'ishtecha amra, and he says to the husband, "Your wife said haveli giti," in both cases of misrepresentation. So now we need to know how this case works, because it does conflict with our opening statement of Rav Nachman. It says the Gemara, in those cases, if he says, "V'hu amar holech v'tein la," you can just give it to her, or zachila, or bimizakeh her, you can acquire it on her behalf, or v'hiskabel la, you can receive it for her, ratzalachs or yachzor, he's allowed to retract. But mishi gia get liyada, only when it gets to her hand, then megureshes. My love, isn't it the case that it's kabbalah a kabbalah, v'holacha a holacha? This is a very complex question. It looks a little easy. It's not. But there really were two versions of this brisa. One case was where she said have, and he misrepresented by saying he's kabel. And the other was where she said he's kabel, and he misrepresented by saying have. And he said, just get it to her. So perhaps we should say that it's kabbalah a kabbalah, that when the wife said the case of kabbalah and he misrepresented, that's what the husband was talking about. And the same is true for when the wife was talking about holacha, that's what the husband was talking about. So says the Gemara, no, that's not correct. Lo, it's kabbalah aholacha v'holacha kabbalah. It's a bigger chiddush that under all circumstances, no matter what comment she said, he responded in kind by saying, "I'm okay with this divorce." So then the Gemara says that's a problem, because I kabbalah aholacha, if we're crisscrossing the cases where even if she said kabbalah, and the husband established that it's okay for it to be the shlichus of holacha, michimat gita liyade, then if you're saying it's a case of kabbalah, then it should not be when it gets to her, it should be when it gets to his hand. And therefore, says the Gemara, going back to where we started, here too is another raya, says the Gemara, that we are able to answer our question from Bava Metzia, that it seems to be that we follow the wording of the shliach, because the Gemara is suggesting over here that if in fact the shliach said, if in fact the shliach misrepresented and said he's kabel, that really what your wife said was that I'm a shliach kabbalah. So then if we're following him, they should be divorced right away. So therefore, maybe we have an answer to the question that we started with today, that maybe we can answer our question from the case in Bava Metzia. So to this, the Gemara says, not necessarily. 2/3 of the way down on Samech Gimel Amud Aleph, Hachi Hashta, how are these cases comparable? Hasam, over there, Ka'amar le Heilach Kemasha Amra. In one case, he said, "Do as you see fit." That's the case that we started with. Those words are found 4 lines and 3 lines from the bottom of Samech Beis and Beis. That's the case where he said Heilach. But Hacha, Mika Amar Le Heilach Kemasha Amra. In our case, that's not true. So therefore, you can't learn anything from our case. Back to the case of Bava Metzia, because the cases are not similar. Next, the Gemara says 10-12 lines from the bottom, he's kabeli giti. If a woman establishes that someone should be mekabel the get on her behalf, the ishtacha amra, and the shliach goes to the husband and says, no, your wife said he's kabeli giti. Vehu omer heilach v'tein. He actually doesn't misrepresent. Here he does it the right way. And then the husband says, go give it to her, or zachila, let her acquire it. V'his kabel, receive it on her behalf. Then in all of these cases, ratzalachs or lo yachzor, because the shliach is a shliach lekabbalah, according to the Balas Abbas, to the wife, and according to the husband. Everyone agrees this guy is lekabbalah, they should be divorced. Reb Nassan makes a distinction. Reb Nassan Omer holech v'teinla rotza lachzor lachzor. In regards to the languages of holech v'teinla, they can still go back. And in regards to the language of zachila and v'iskabela, then rotza lachzor lo yachzor. So there, the Gemara says that Reb Nassan bifurcates and splits a little bit the sheet of the Tanna Kama. Rebbe Omer, Rebbe says something that sounds a lot like the Tanna Kama, and the Gemara is going to call it out. Bikulan im rotza lachzor lo yachzor, aval. I don't want you to be the recipient. The husband says to the shliach, but I only want the wife. Then ratza lachzor yachzor, he's allowed. So the Gemara says, Rebbe hainu taina kama. The first shita of this brisa and Rebbe, the third shita of this brisa, seem to align. So the Gemara says, not necessarily. One possible answer that we can say is efshi. In the case of EFC, because that language in the sheet of Rebbe was not found in the Tanna Kama, and EFC would be another limiting language that the Tanna Kama doesn't have, but that Rebbe does. Or says the Gemara, Kamash Malan, Man Tanna Kama, Rebbe. Or this is a very difficult answer. Why would we quote the Tanna Kama separate of Rebbe if they're all the same? But that's what the Gemara says, that perhaps the opening shita, which says that if a woman says to a shliach, he's kabbalah, that you should be my shliach lekabbalah, and the husband says a whole host of languages, then lo yachzor, that's also the shita of Rebbe. Okay, let's move to something that's a little bit less esoteric in its language, because I understand that this is a little bit complicated to hold cup with all the subtleties in language. Says the Gemara, let's go back to an old sugya we've discussed a number of times in Shas already. We're 3 lines from the bottom on Samach Gimel Amud Aleph. The Gemara says, if a person says Heilach, and yesterday we highlighted that Heilach is a stronger language. I want this to be yours is what Heilach basically means. It's different than Holech, oh, please bring this. Heilach is a stronger language. So the Gemara says, Heilach l'Reb Nassan kizchidami. According to Reb Nassan, remember in the Brisa, 6 lines from the bottom of this page, according to Reb Nassan, Ratza lachzor was lo yachzor. Ratza lachzor was yachzor. Reb Nassan said that if he says Holech, it's Ratza lachzor. What would he say about Heilach? So he only talks about holech, which means to bring, but heilach is really, again, the stronger language of this really belongs to you. So Ibailu, the question is, do we say that heilach l'Rav Nassan is kizchitami? If he says to her that heilach, I want you to have your get, are they divorced? Is that kizchi, like they've already made the acquisition? Or perhaps lav kizchitami, or no, is the language according to Rav Nassan not really stronger than holech. So we're trying to figure out right now about the language of heilach according to Reb Nassan. According to Reb Nassan, holech is, he can be choser on holech. But heilach, that stronger language, how does Reb Nassan feel about it? So the Gemara attempts to bring a response. 2 lines from the bottom on Samech Gimel Amud Aleph, and the Gemara says as follows. Toshma, ha'omer hiskabel get ze li'ishti. If a man says, if a man says he's kabel get zeli ishti, which we know he's not supposed to do because a husband can't create a shliach for his wife. But if a man says to a shliach, I want you to receive this for my wife, or if he says holech get zeli ishti, please bring this to my wife, ratza lachzor yachzor, he can always go back on that until it gets to her hands. In other words, the shliach is not a shliach lekabbalah because he cannot establish him as a shliach lekabbalah without his wife saying so. Ha'isha sha'amra he's kabel ligiti. But if the woman chooses who the shliach is, and then she receives that, he receives it on her behalf, then lo yachzor, then they're actually divorced. So says the Gemara, my la b'dehelach v'Reb Nassan. Doesn't this seem to be like the language of Heilach according to Reb Nassan? And therefore we have a possible answer. And says the Gemara, look at the top Rashi, Dibur Hamaschal, my love Heilach katani ba. Maybe he'd agree that Heilach is much stronger. Says the Gemara, no, it doesn't say Heilach. You're just making a jump and an assumption. That's not what it says. Really, it's Beholech v'Rebbe. Maybe it's talking about Holech, and it's Rebbe who was machmir under certain lashonos, under certain circumstances. So no raya for Reb Nassan. So the Gemara on the top of Samach Gimel Amud Beis tries again. Toshma, lefichach. We had said in our Mishnah, Im Omar lo habal, if he says, if the husband says the only way we're divorced is if it's in her hands, and I don't allow any other iterations, if that's the language he says, he's allowed to be choser until it gets in her hand. What's the deal? 4 lines down. Time to Amar EFC. Lo Amar EFC. Ratzalachzor lo yachzor. If he doesn't say EFC, then they in fact will be divorced, which seems to be a stronger scenario of divorce. That sounds like a possibility for Heilach. My love beHeilach v'Reb Nassan. Perhaps this is a raya where we can see that Rab Nasan might hold of Halach. Says the Gemara, no, here too, lo, beholech v'Rebbe. Here it might be the opinion of Holech according to Rebbe, where he is strict, but no raya for Rab Nasan in the language of Halach. So let's try again. Toshma, the Brisa says, Holech get zeli ishti. If a person says, bring this get to my wife, Ratza lachzor yachzor. If that's all he says is bring this to my wife, then he can recant until it gets into her hands. Oh, here's a stronger language. But if it says Heilach get zeli ishti, Ratza lachzor lo yachzor, this is an explicit case scenario to our question. We were trying to figure out what the power is of the word Heilach. This brisa specifically talks about the word Heilach. So the Gemara says, Man shamas leida amar beholech ratza lachzor yachzor Reb Nasan v'kamar behelach ratza lachzor lo yachzor shma mina Heilach kizchidami shma mina. We therefore seem to have a pretty clear raya that the brisa says that Heilach is a very powerful language and it's more powerful than Holech. That's how the Gemara concludes. And therefore, if one were to say the language of Heilach in Hebrew, Heilach get zeli ishti, then the halacha is that she'd be divorced right upon any transfer whatsoever. Heilach is therefore a more powerful language than Holech, and that is how the Gemara concludes that little piece of discussion on Heilach kizchidami. And the Gemara says about a quarter of the way down, we'll be going to the Mishnah at the bottom of the page. The Gemara says as follows, Itmar, let's go back to a source that we saw in the Amoraim. He's kabali giti, if she says to a man or to a woman, please be the shliach lekabala, I want you to receive my get for me. When you receive it, I'll be divorced. And then the shliach misrepresents, and the shliach represents himself to the husband, v'ishtacha amra, and she says to the husband, your wife told me he's kabali giti. And then the husband says, "V'hu omer holech v'tein givaldik." I'm sick of her. Here are the papers. Let's get this over with. So Amar Rabbi Abba, Amar Rav Huna, Amar Rav, Nase shlucho v'shlucha v'choletzes. That this person becomes both of those people. This guy is functioning in a dual capacity, and that is very complicated. When you have one person functioning in a dual capacity, he is both his representative and her representative. The Gemara says that's not a normal shlichus, and therefore, b'choletzes, if there was a case of yibum, if the husband died before she got the get and she had no kids, there in theory should be yibum in such a case. The Gemara says she can only do chalitza, no yibum, because we're not really sure how divorced she is, because this shlichus is a double-sided shlichus. Says the Gemara lemeimra, does that leave the following implication? To misafka leile Rav holech kischidami ilav kischidami? Is it possible that Rav was unclear about the din of holech kischi or holech lav kischi? Because after all, we should say over here one way or the other, because the case was where he was hiskabel. They should have said that they were divorced. Says the Gemara, after all, what does Rav say? Elsewhere, Rav says, and this is a third of the way down on the Amud, Samach Gimel Amud Beis, Ve'itmar holech mana leploni shani chayav lo, Amar Rav chayav b'achrayusavim ba'alach sorein chozer. This is the real deal. So he would say holech is kischi. So why does it seem like Rav in our case is saying choletzes, which sounds like he's besafek, yet in another case by Mamonis, he had no problem putting his foot down and saying what the halacha is? Is Rav confused? So usually the answer to that question is no. And the Gemara says as follows: Hasam over there, safek mamona lekula. There we were talking about a safek mamon, but here we're dealing with something else. Hacha safek yisur lechumra. They're both sveikos according to Rav. Everything is besafek according to Rav in this case of holech. We don't know, and in both cases, he needs to treat them besafek. Next, we're halfway down on Samach Gimel Amud Beis. The Gemara shifts a little bit and asks the following question. Omar Rav. Rav says, Ein ha'isha osa shliach lekabel lagita miyad shliach baila. A woman is not allowed to use her husband's shliach. Reb Chanina Amar, no, isha osa shliach lekabel lagita miyad shliach baila. Let me say that a little bit better. If I'm the husband and I have a shliach, and my wife also wants to have a shliach, so we're using two intermediaries. I'm giving, let's do Ruvain and Rachel is the couple. Ruvain gives it to Shimon, who is his shliach. Shimon gives it to Shprinza, who is her shliach. So that's the first sheet over here, is that in the name of Rav, Ein ha'isha oseh shliach lekabel agita miyad shliach baila. Is that if the woman knows that I picked out Shimon, she can't then send Shprinza. Only one shliach is allowed, according to Rav. That's what it seems from the Gemara. Reb Chanina Amar, not that way. He says, no, isha oseh shliach lekabel agita miyad shliach baila. We're allowed to have two intermediaries. There's nothing wrong with that. My time at the Rav. What is the reason why Rav was strict about this? So says the Gemara, perhaps it's a bizayon to the husband. Perhaps it's the case that the husband holds, that we hold by the husband, it's bizayon for her to add another layer between them. He sent a shliach and he wants that shliach to go to her. She now wants to add another shliach. That might be a bizayon to the Baal. That's one possibility. Or there's another concern that we saw earlier in the Masechta, some 40 blot ago. This is a case that we saw of where a woman could get potentially divorced in a very confusing way. So let's say I wanted to divorce my wife, and I don't, by the way, but let's say that I did. Let's just talk about Ruvain and Rachel. Let's pick a different name because my wife's name is Rachel, okay? Rachel, Ruvain and Shpritza. Let's not ruin this. So let's say that Ruvain's married to Shpritza and he wants to get divorced. So Ruvain takes his get and he throws it into somebody else's yard, his neighbor, Chaim. And then she buys Chaim's yard with her get in it. What's the din? So first of all, he didn't throw it into her yard. He threw it into somebody else's yard and then she bought it. So that's somewhat of a confusing case. So the Gemara says we want to try and avoid that case, and therefore better to have one intermediary than two. Now, my beinayu, what's the difference between these two approaches of bizayon debal and chatzera? So says the Gemara, ika beinayu dekadma ihi v'shavya shliach meikara. Very creative. The Gemara says the difference between them would be as if this woman knew her husband was going to be writing a get. So let's say the husband and wife, you got Ruvain and Shpritza, they're in the middle of an all-out, verbal match, and they decide they're going to get divorced. Before wasting a minute, she picks up the phone and says to her best friend, Chanala, I want you to be my shliach Kabbalah. Before the husband assigns one, then she already made one. According to the approach of Bizayon Debal, that's not my problem. And therefore, that would be a nafkamina between the case of Bizayon Debal and the case of Chatzera Bala Acharika. A story, finally. Says the Gemara, 2/3 of the way down, almost 2/3 of the way down. Oh, Gavra, there was a man, the Shadar La Gita Le Debisu, and he wanted to send a divorce to his wife. He wanted to send a get to his wife. Azal Shlicha, Ashkeche Ki Yasva V'Kalisha. He got there, and she was kneading challah. She was kneading dough. What did he say? Omar La Heilach Gitech. Here's your get, he said to her. Her hands covered in sticky challah dough. Amr Le, she said to him, Lehave biyadcha. Let it be in your hands. So is that a divorce? Let's think this through from what we know in this Masechta so far. If the shliach brings a get to a woman, what's the din? Isn't it v'nasan biyada? Should be. So she says, I'm okay with you holding it and therefore effecting my get. Says the Gemara, Amar Rav Nachman, Im Isa l'Reb Chanina, if we hold like the opinion of Reb Chanina, that a woman is allowed to have an intermediary along with the husband, so then avdi ba'uvda, then something actually happened here and they should be divorced. But Amar le Rava, v'im isa l'Reb Chanina avdis ba'uvda, what does this have to do with Reb Chanina? It has nothing to do with Reb Chanina. Halo chazr shlichus eitzel habal. This is a big problem. You can't have the same shliach for both people, because that means that the shliach can't then go back to the Baal and say, I'm your shliach, because he's not. Now he's her shliach, because he started part one of his shlichus was 90%. He walks down the block to her house. He gets there. She's making challah. And she says, forget it. You hold it. That'll be my divorce. I'm happy to get good riddance. Goodbye. Let's figure out the divorce and split the money and split the kids and the dog. So the guy's, she's ready to get divorced, but that's a technical issue with the world of shlichus. So says the Gemara, we didn't know what to do. And the Gemara says, Shalchuha lekame, the Rabbi Ami, and Shalach lehu lo chazr shlichus eitzel habal. This is a problem. We cannot have the wife say that you, the shliach of the husband, can hold the papers and be divorced, because that makes him an invalid shliach as it relates to the husband. I need to sit and think about it. This is complicated. Let's paint the case one more time so we have it vivid in our minds. So Ruvain sends Shimon to be the shliach for Shpritza, and Shimon walks down the block into Shpritza's house, and he says, Rebbetzin, I'm sorry, I'm giving you your divorce papers, but her hands are dirty. So she says, I want you to be the shliach for me. So is that allowed? So the first approach is you're not allowed. The second approach is, and this is on the first of the very long lines, is nisyashib badavar. I'm really unsure what the answer is. I need to think about it. So then the Gemara says, Then they sent him the shaila again. Sometimes you send the second email a little too quickly. You probably should have let a few days lapse. And Rav Chia bar Abba was annoyed. Amar, he said, Kol hani shalchu lavaza. You keep sending me all these letters. I don't know the answer. Just like it's a suffix to all of you guys. I don't know the answer to your question. I have no idea. And the Gemara concludes out of sheer concern. So basically, he's unsure. And because we're dealing with a davar shebe'erva, in a case scenario where he would die before this scenario is resolved, while Shimon is standing next to Shprinza, the husband dies. While he's holding the get, after she said, I want you to be my shliach also, so then the din is that if she died without children and Ruvain's brother is available for marriage, she cannot do yibum, she can only do chalitza, because we have a davar shebe'erva issue and we cannot be mekel at all. Next. Hava Uvda, there was a similar story where this occurred. Ba'atzricha, Rabbi Yitzchak bar Shmuel bar Marta, get v'chalitza. Wow. Here, this took place, and the case that the consequence was that we needed to get v'chalitza. So says the Gemara, Tarte? What do you mean, get v'chalitza? The man's dead. What are you worried about? Says the Gemara, get mechaim. No, it's only, meaning if the guy didn't die yet, he held that a different get had to be given. And v'chalitza la'achar mitzvah, but had the husband died, then yes, we would have required chalitza. We're at the 2 dots, 5 lines into the wide lines toward the bottom of Samech Gimel Amud Beis. Hahi dahavu karla Nefasa. Rough first name for elementary school, but her first name was Nefasa. And Azal Saadeh and Kasu Tifasa. They wrote her name wrong. So says the Gemara, Amar Rav Yitzchak bar Shmuel bar Marta mishmei derav asu edim shlichusam. They did their shlichus. They were asked to write a get, and they did, which is kind of funny because they did a pretty poor job. Usually, when we hire people to do things and they do a poor job, we tell them, you did a poor job, go do it again. I'm not paying you for your trash work. Go fix your job. So here they spelled the name wrong, and Rav says that it's considered that they've done their shlichus, and therefore they can't even write a new get if they wanted to. Maskif la Rabba, Mika Amar Lahu Ksuvu Chaspa v'Havula. Did he tell them to go graffiti a piece of pottery and hand it to her? They did a terrible job. They did not do their shlichus. Absolutely not. Elo Amar Rabba Vada Ikasav Sade Gita Ma'alya ve'Avad Asu Edim Shlichusan. No, if you wrote a beautiful star, you wrote the name Nifasa instead of Tifasa, you said the name correctly, and then, okay, you lost it. There we would say you're no longer a shliach. You've done your job. So then the Gemara says, wait, Maskif lo Rav Nachman, Mika Amar Lahu Ksuvo ve'Ancho Bekisaichu. What are you talking about? So you wrote a beautiful star and then you dropped it. You're not done with your shlichus yet. I asked you to do something and you failed. Oh, you wrote a beautiful star. Congratulations. That doesn't count. You didn't do your job. Ella Amar Rav Nachman Kosman v'Nosnan Afilu Mea Pa'amim. This is how we think as Americans. So you get it right. I don't want to. Don't come back to me until this is done. Don't tell me about your mistakes. Don't tell me about your failures. You spelled the name wrong. Go back and fix it. You lost it. Go print another one. I don't want to hear about it. So this is how we Americans think, by and large. It's usually what we think. So says the Gemara, what about the following? Ba'mine Rava me Rav Nachman. Rava, 4th generation. Rav Nachman was 3rd generation. Rav Nachman was the one who said the previous comment, who said, keep working on it until you get it right. Your shlichus is not done until it's done. So says the Gemara, the question that Rava asked of Rav Nachman was, if a person said to a shliach, kasvu utnu l'shliach, mahu, what if it gets lost? What then would we say? Would we say that if they wrote it and they were supposed to give it to her, and it was only to a shliach, mahu sluke salik lahu, they did their job, odilma litrachadi tuchaish, that they should continue working on it. So Amalei Ravina l'Rabashi as well, ve'yolichla mahu, this language of yolichla, which isn't a super strong language, what would we say? And in all of these cases, teku. So there will be a limit to what a shliach has to do, what a shliach is capable of doing, but the Gemara concludes with a teku. And one last little piece of Gemara to conclude with for the day. We had learned the other day that Reb Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, Af HaOmer is totally giti, this light language of take this get, imrat alachs or lo yachs, or he was very strict about it. Tana Rabban, and the Brisa writes, totally Visali v'hil biyadcha kulan lashon kabalahin. he has a very broad understanding. Rav Shimon Gamliel has a very broad understanding of what a lashon of Kabbalah is, and therefore, the second a shliach takes it, she's going to be considered divorced with no possibilities for chazara. And the truth is that Rav Shimon ben Gamliel would uproot probably the whole daf that we just learned just now, because he'd be very strict on a lot of different languages, even languages that we would have assumed are languages that are kal, tol, viheli, and what was the third one? Visali, very soft. It doesn't matter. It's becoming clear what the husband wants. He wants to get divorced. So we'll stop right here. We'll pick up Emir Hashem tomorrow with a new Mishnah toward the bottom of Samach Gimel Amud Beis. Wishing you all a beautiful night.